Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. Another very vindicated episode of the War Report, may I add, because we have quite a bit of news, quite a bit of stuff to get into. Yet again on Ukraine and Russia and the invasion that is going to happen any day now. We're just all, holding our breath, just waiting for it, and it's going to be horrible. And but it's okay because Ukraine has brave women warriors who will defend the country. That's what I've been assured from by the State Department, CIA. Some propagandists assured me of that. So who am I to doubt that? But before we get into that, we have some news regarding Syria. And with what you have there, the main action out of Syria is in northwestern Syria with Turkish forces and Turkish backed forces um, launching strikes and shelling various rival opposition groups and Kurdish groups. Now, this is quite the market escalation in the past several months. This is probably um, one of the heaviest actions we've seen Turkey take in quite some time. Possibly over the course of just the past 12 months, it might be one of the largest ones. And again, as we were discussing a few weeks back, a few months back, I believe at this point, with Erdogan on the ropes, with his popularity um, teetering a bit on the edge, and with the economic troubles in Turkey, he was, even before all that, eager for some sort of material victory in Syria, something he can bring home to the people. And now, even much more so, he is eager to bring something home to the people in Turkey and saying, look what we accomplished in Syria. And the situation internally in Turkey, at least economically, seems to have settled down a bit. It doesn't seem like Erdogan is quite as on the ropes as he was. I know he was really overplaying his hand there, which I suppose isn't to be a surprise for Erdogan. So it looks like they're just trying to reassert their foothold, and you also have some activity from pro-government forces, again creeping slowly but surely into Idlib. And then you had a little bit of a mess in Al-Hasaka in that northeastern part of Syria, where
Yeah.
the government controls part of the city, but nothing else completely is run by SDF-controlled forces. There was a case where the British forces tried to pass through the Syrian-occupied portion of the city, and they were turned away. You've had, of course, over the past few weeks, the general chasing away of convoys, the operation of Russian troops in the area, all the usual things to expect from, again, northeastern Syria. Alleged ISIS members detained, skirmishes, and it looks like things are slowly but surely still boiling in Syria. And once again, I imagine as something like Ukraine or even possibly Taiwan in the near future, depending on how that situation goes, Syria will take this opportunity while it's out of the international spotlight in order to make these gains, and all the various factions will take the opportunity while the world's focused on something else to really try to finalize the Syrian war, because more or less what you're looking at is the outcome of the war, and it's just to be determined who officially wins what. And I've been saying for quite some time now, for about the past year, that with what we're looking at in Syria is the fighting, of course, it still continues, but any major offensive, any major tide turning victories, those are almost all done, if not completely done.
hmm
And what where the fate of Syria will be decided is at the negotiating table with powers like Turkey, Russia, Iran, even say Israel. I think to a much lesser extent, I think they've been somewhat sidelined. Some of the European players, say France, Germany, again in terms of also being sidelined, the Americans have also been sidelined out of Syria. But pretty much the coalition to determine Syria's future will come down to what we saw frequently in 2018, which I believe will be Russia, Iran, and Turkey will be the three major players that will determine Syria's future. Now, Turkey will act as a proxy for American interests and possibly broader NATO and Western interests. I'm sure they'll have to give Israel some sort of concession. Who knows what, but this is speculating a bit far into the future. But point being is, Syria is going through one of those ebbs and flows where things are boiling up again. But like I said, aside from the fall of Idlib, which I have gone on the record many times saying I slate by the summer of 2022, the summer of this year. I don't see any major change in Syria beyond that in the near future.
Right. The other thing that's happened is Israel has now limited some of its air campaign in Syria because the Russians and the Syrians are working together with their air patrols. So you've noticed now that there have been far, far fewer attacks. One of the ways that they're working together is the Russians will fly the jets and the Syrians will fly the attack helicopters. Also, the Russians have imported more anti-air systems. So that also is helping, as you well described, the process of the war as it lingers on towards a gradual finish. All the big important cities are in control of Assad, and so now it's a kind of a brutal way of convincing the other powers that they can't win this.
Well, the real question is when will American support for the SDF officially end? Because we
Yes.
saw a glimpse of what it would look like when the American withdrawals were kicked about in 2018, 2019, where you had so called SDF officials meeting with the Syrian government and making pretty substantial deals with the Syrian government.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
the question is, what really ends this war is when America officially drops its
that's right.
support for the SDF, which would have been thought of a nigh impossibility just a year ago. But after Afghanistan, I think any sort of withdrawal is possible.
Yeah. Basically, anywhere America leaves, the natural order will take over. We saw it in Afghanistan, and like as you say, for a short period of time, we saw it in 2018 when a significant portion of American service members left Syria. We saw exactly what would happen. Now, America was so disappointed with that, just as they were so disappointed with how quickly all the forces that they contributed so much billions of dollars for such a long period of time um, decided basically not to fight. And I mean, there was some resistance at the beginning, but it didn't last very long. And they just, they did not have the mandate to rule. And that's the same situation in Syria. And I think basically we'll get into it, but as things are developing in Ukraine, let's not forget that there are approximately two definite pipeline deals that the world has been waiting on for 11 years to go through Syria. And there's a third one that would go, from Saudi Arabia up through Jordan and so on. But um, let's say there's three. Uh, Russia and Syria hold the key to that, right? And what happens in Ukraine determines also what happens in Syria, because that's a bargaining chip. There are all these countries like Qatar, like Saudi Arabia, that would love to have a pipeline that goes into the Mediterranean and feeds into Europe, right? And I think myself personally, I think one of the reasons why the West has decided to get really serious about global warming and electric cars is they know they're not going to get those pipelines. They
Oh,
they just
absolutely. Going
they
back
know
to
they're not
green
going to get them.
imperialism, as we've discussed
But they
many
cannot
times.
admit that they can't get them. But
Absolutely.
windmills are not going to be enough, and there's generally a great dissatisfaction with leaders and the way they are leading countries in the West. It's growing. There's a cynicism that is saturating the lower classes, and it can only go on for so long. And they can play these games of like, we're not going to have nuclear. We're windmills and solar panels and electric cars will solve all our problems. They can play this game like the invasion game, but that's not reality.
Yes, and with that, as you mentioned with the pipelines with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, even a lot of these countries have come to the table with Syria. Saudi Arabia, I would say, most notably, and you could even say Qatar, which sort of pivoted towards Iran in 2018, 2019, if you recall, where
Hmm.
they have tried to lift Syria's suspension from membership in the Arab League, have sought to reestablish diplomatic ties, cut off funding to various rebel groups that they were funding. And again, with what we see in all of that, America and the West have been snubbed, and all the pipelines are coming from the east. And uh, one could say that Azerbaijan was sort of a last ditch attempt at really trying to get a pro Western pipeline. One could argue that the current dispute and the current war over there was something of that. But
Hmm.
again, all the grand energy projects the West had for decades, and again up until about 2012, since about the outbreak of the Syrian War, um, and that has been completely turned on its head in even less than a decade. Because there was still hope at the beginning of the Syrian War that it was going to go in their favor, and that they were going to get these pipelines, and that they were going to undermine Russia in this way. But no, it looks like, as you were saying, Syria and Russia have become the kingmakers of whatever energy transits through Syria, and
That's right. And
that
Biden has dropped the proposed pipeline that would be somewhere around that area of Israel, Lebanon, Cyprus, and that would feed into Europe. That's been dropped.
yeah, and I remember
Apparently,
that
because
was a big
it
deal that we
that
dedicated
yeah,
like
it
an entire
was.
episode to that, and of course Trump was very behind that, and yeah, because you had I think it was Italy, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority in Egypt all cooperating on this project. Um,
Yeah,
and I mean, when you got like Israel and the Palestinian Authority to agree on that, like I thought, oh wow, this is really going somewhere. But apparently, without the U.S. backing, that has more or less fallen apart. And that was, of course, supposed to be rivaled to the pipeline that Turkey wanted to build again in their entire intervention in Libya because of that and the territorial disputes there. So, I mean, Biden is really just putting the American empire into full retreat in the way that I would say a lot of Trump supporters could have only dreamed of. Now, I think we're realizing a much harsher reality of that because of the circumstances we're getting out. We're more so being pushed out rather than, bowing out gracefully, which I think is what theoretically a Trump foreign policy would have done. Now, I'm not saying he ever went in there with that intention or whatever, but I think a lot of people understood, a lot of people on our side understood that, you know, a Trump administration would be bowing out gracefully from a lot of these foreign theaters and a lot of these foreign disputes. That's what I would have liked to see, and I'm
yeah,
pretty sure that's what most of our audience would have liked to see. But now, 4 years later, 3, 4 years later, it's we're being forced out. We're being pushed to the sidelines, which I mean, out is out. I'm glad we're being more and more disconnected from this. I'm glad the American empire is, retracting in strength, but it's a much more painful process for, I would say, everyone involved. And with all that being
yeah.
said, one of the interesting things of all this is you have Turkey in this, and sort of the pivot on which NATO spins. And I believe even Turkey did some half-ass comment when it came to intervention in Ukraine. They cautioned the Russians against it, but they never gave their full support to Ukraine, which has been the story of the NATO and Western threats against Russia about Ukraine, where they will talk a big game, they will maneuver their troops, they will do whatever, but none of them will make that solid commitment. Now, there's obvious reasons why they wouldn't make that solid commitment, but none of them will even implicitly make that solid commitment. Because it's not one of those things you can come out right and say, but
That's right.
there's nothing to substantiate the fact that they would stand with Ukraine in any real sense, even in terms of material support, in the event of a Russian attack. And it's gotten to the point where um, several NATO members, I would say Croatia really started this chain of events where the typical conception of NATO is, post Cold War at least, that these former Eastern Bloc states that joined were much more hawkish because they were much more wary of Russia because of their recent history, which is generally true. Whereas the Western states wanted to maintain NATO for common defense for pretty much all the perks and none of the responsibilities. That's what the narrative was, at least. So, for example, you have Germany willing to, cooperate on a pipeline with Russia and stuff like that. But Croatia set off this chain of Eastern European countries where Croatia said if anything materially actually happens in Ukraine, we're bowing out, we're going home. Bulgaria, the next day, seconded that statement. Even Poland has made remarks to the like that we're not dying for the sake of Ukraine. And so the most bellicose, what you'd expect to be the most bellicose countries in NATO, have already balked at this. And again, Turkey made their half-assed threats that they didn't really give any indication that they would even follow up on. And Biden's solution, I know you have quite a bit to say about this, so I'll hand it over to you, is to put the toughest sanctions on Russia there ever has been.
Yeah. Yeah, this is hilarious. But just to round things out, as far as Middle East news, it basically Iran damaged an airliner with a rocket attack at U.S. Camp Victory. It's a huge hole. I mean, this is going to have to involve major, major repair. And, they may or may not have the facilities to repair it, but it's impressive. But that said, if you want to get into the Ukraine thing, so yeah, I think the important thing for the audience to remember is that the worst sanctions on Russia actually were put in place in 2014. As I've said repeatedly, the whole point of those sanctions was that Russia would bend the knee and leave Syria. That's what was supposed to happen. If you think that America was going to place sanctions on that would kind of hurt it, you know. But the real escalation is going to come later. No, that narrative is wrong. The fact is no one expected Russia to overcome those sanctions. And now they are not escalating the sanctions war. They are literally digging it to the bottom of the barrel for anything that they could throw against them that wouldn't hurt Europe. And now, if it really came down to it, who knows? They might hurt Europe in order for their survival. But as a memo was published by, again, a senior member of the Biden administration, whose name is not mentioned, and today it was confirmed, there is not going to be a ban on Russia from SWIFT. So I know Poland, Ukraine believe that be able to get Russian gas for from Russia, while Russia is off of SWIFT, so they won't have to pay them for it, right? Or you can put in ballistic missiles on their borders, but Russia's still obligated to give them gas and oil. It's really hilarious
Yeah, and
that
that's
these
that's the other
countries
question. Will
literally
America
say
stop
things
importing
like,
Russian
yeah,
oil
they
and
literally
gas?
say you're politicizing gas. It's like, actually, you already politicized the gas. Like, what are you talking about? Anyhow, so the sanctions that were levied against Russia back in 2014 were meant to destroy it. Basically, they sanctioned all these Russian banks, including the National Bank, so that it could not function. And even financial institutions that were not sanctioned could not borrow money. So what Russia did, of course, they already started this process very late 2013 of de-dollarizing that we dealt with in the last show. But of course, they also leaned on both China and on the EU, and they gradually began to replace US dollars with EU and yuan. Uh, Plus, they also created money markets where, if a company has debt, we'll buy it up. It's not an unusual practice. Now, people have talked about, the Russian sell-off that happened, but the fact is a sell-off happened in America as well as Europe after 2000, about 2014 to 2018. So that was more of a worldwide event, and it was not particular to Russia. right? So what basically happened is nothing that was intended to cripple Russia worked. In fact, it made Russia um, cripple Russia's, say, food imports. Instead, Russia worked its way around it and became the leading grain exporter. Uh, Another project was the U.S. Around this time put a sanction on carbon fiber, so Russia couldn't finish building some of its aircraft. Right? Well, it did delay things for 18 months, but Russia just created. Russia stopped depending on gas and oil. So instead of like 40-50% of its revenue, it's now well under 25. Some estimates state it's actually only between 10 and 15%. In any case, whatever the actual figure is, the sanctions didn't work. So that already tells you that the actual amount of GDP is based on fuels is much lower because dual use technologies, technologies for extracting resources, were also part of the sanctions package that was supposed to cripple Russia's oil and gas sectors. It didn't work. Russia's oil and gas has steadily increased, and it has more sway in organizations like OPEC Plus, as we saw at the beginning or the end of the first quarter of 2020, just when COVID hit, right? Um, so none of these tactics have worked. They're not crippling Russia. Russia is actually more resilient than ever. Their reserve is far higher than it's ever been, something that you can't say about Ukraine. By 2013, Ukraine had amassed $80.5 billion in reserve currencies, right? And now it's at 1.5. So what happened? Um, Ukraine, for all intents and purposes, is gutted. Like so many other countries, it's gutted. And its entire life system depends on what the West decide to do with it, right? That's it. But the sanctions, the only sanctions left, I think there are people in Biden's administration that realize that if they go along with them, the division that you already see happening within NATO, within the EU, within Europe, is only going to broaden. And so they have decided not to take Russia off the SWIFT, not, unless, of course, there's an invasion. Well, I mean, Russia isn't going to invade Ukraine, right? Russia is not going to somehow take over Kiev, and it's going to have 20 million new citizens, and like that, at least 10 million will not appreciate this. At the very least, 10 million. I don't think Russia wants to manage that. I also don't think even if they all unanimously wanted to be part of Russia, Russia economically cannot lift them up. To say nothing of the kind of court cases, right? Gazprom is in a court case in Britain right now with Ukraine for $3.5 billion that Ukraine hasn't paid. And Germany has to do a flow back using the Yamal pipelines so that Ukraine can get oil and gas. Belarus, who has been thanked in the Rada, uh, particularly Lushenko, for delivering them enough energy so that they can survive the winter. This is Ukraine, who doesn't even recognize Lushenko as the legitimate president of Belarus, has to eventually thank Belarus to have enough fuel for winter. Okay, that's where we are right now. And there's, I mean, I think Russia is playing a long game that is getting shorter because the natural circumstances, the historical process is winding up. And, will there be a false flag attack that is to lure Russia in? It's entirely possible. But if you look at the media in Ukraine, Zelensky has had to go publicly twice now to calm the public. Why? Because this speculation is causing everyday Ukrainians to take out all their money out of the banks. This, of course, I said this in the last episode, can put a run on the banks, right? That could be um, a default on loan situation. They could be headed towards where Lebanon is, right? And then they'll be more malleable. So I think Putin's strategy is every time the West says he's going to invade, he'll say, we're not going to invade. He'll bring in more troops, and then they'll say, aha, 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 you see? But he's still not going to invade. What he wants is the hysteria in the West to go at a maximal level. During that time, what he's going to do is he's going to send, like he already has, a missile system in Belarus. And this is pissed off Poland to such a degree that now they're building a wall. Yes, technically, the wall is to stop refugees, but I think the wall is symbolic of more things than that, right? So, and of course, Belarus is gone. NATO will not get Belarus. Belarus is well on way to becoming fully integrated as another republic within Russia. That is for certain. And what that does is, and people are saying, well, isn't Russia afraid of having more NATO on its borders? I mean, they've expressed that they don't like it. They're also bargaining from a position where the West will have to meet them somewhere halfway, and the Russians might be happy with that. That's a speculation, but I think one of the reasons why there's more than one. One of them is it's so outrageous that the Americans can either laugh it off and say we're not even meeting, or they go to the meetings. And if the meetings continue, then that means that the Russians are smoking them out. That they want to see the Americans actually take it more seriously. I don't think the Russians are expecting results right away, right? The whole point is to make the West nervous to the point that there's fracturing. And you see that Macron is in conversation with Putin on the they had a telephone conversation today, and Macron, of course, as he's thinking about the situation in Europe, he wants to see, uh, basically better cooperation with Russia. Um, Now, the argument that the Russians are using, of course, is the OSCE basically stating there was a meeting in Istanbul and another one, I forget the name of it, the other city. But basically, it meant like you cannot have an alliance or security agreement in Europe if you're going to threaten the security of another country. So that's the line of argument that the Russians are using as a critique against NATO. Um, Now, there are going to be other visitors, and much to the dismay of Brazilian media, Bolsonaro is expected to go to Russia in the first week of February. So, yeah, um, we've had to mention this on the show over and over again, and I still see a lot of bad takes on the right wing about this in the West. But no, it's not in Russia's interest. Ukraine is teetering on the point of default, and its economy is wrecked and gutted. This is Putin is going to make Ukraine essentially a black hole for the West. Till he's going to make the whole point of Ukraine was to bleed Russia, but Putin is going to make Ukraine bleed the West. You
And on
saw
top of that, he's going to make an example to Russia to what the West really means with freedom and democracy and anti-corruption. It means turning your country into a complete basket case.
right, right. He wants this as a living memory. I think he wants the glory. I would not be. I was very skeptical when he said that he would probably not run in 2024. I think when he's due to leave office. I think it's not unreasonable to think that he's going to see this to its end. That's only 2 years away. Uh, and I think he wants to be there at a very momentous occasion. I think he wants to see that through. I don't think he's leaving before then. Um, so yeah, there's been lots of bad takes, kind of like, is is Russia even really based? This is hilarious because as you see how um, NATO and the collective West has delegitimized itself, it's infected the right wing as well, right? Like for them, in a sense, they've already accepted that their leaders are illegitimate, that their civilization looked at one way because of their leaders is also illegitimate. Um, but now, as things get, I think, tougher, um, and kind of like what we saw with, like, I mean, I was one of those guys that kind of cheered on the Taliban. I mean, I don't care. I don't really have any strong sympathies for the Taliban when it was all over, but it was like January 6th. I'm sorry, but it was hella fun. I like to me, America's not legitimate, and neither is the West, neither is Israel, and so I don't care. Um,
That's a
so
very
does that
surprising
mean I
take
have
from
undying allegiance? No.
that's a very surprising take from Slavic Macedonia. I would have expected you to be very pro-Western. But you brought up the point. People saying Russia's not based, and I got just three. I have three counter arguments for you. Number
Yeah.
one, number two, and number three. Okay, if Russia was not
Yeah.
based, explain this. Explain why they have their own rednecks. Now, this right
Yeah.
here, my friends, is one form of cultural imperialism I can get behind. Look, I love seeing, you can see right here in this top left picture. I love seeing Old Dixie, and even in that top right picture, I love seeing Old Dixie across Europe. It gives me warm and fuzzy feelings inside.
Yeah.
But let's just let that dispel any argument.
Hello,
But
base department.
you do bring a good point that, of course, as the West loses legitimacy, a really last ditch effort to maintain it, it's like, look, our enemies don't have it either, so, like, can we really be worse than them? As if um, Russia's supposed abortion rate is supposed to make me feel better
Yeah, yeah,
about, Drag Queen Story Hour, or
yeah,
any of
yeah,
these things that go on in the West. Like, you can disagree with something and not have it affect your life, but when it's your civic religion, it becomes a problem. Like, again, let's take again those Russian abortion or HIV rates. Let's take all those at face value. Assume the research is complete and honest. That sucks. That's bad for them. I hope they fix that. But I'm more concerned about what's happening, where I live rather than where they live. And no,
yeah.
I'll put it out. I would not want to live in Russia for the very basic reason I am not Russian. I have no Russian heritage. I simply
Yeah.
could not and would not assimilate into Russian society.
Wow,
And
it's almost like Russia's not a proposition nation.
yeah, it's a wild prospect, but I think you might be on something. I think that countries might actually need like an ethnic basis to exist.
Yeah.
But the whole I suppose that is anathema to the idea of at least 20th century America, if you don't want to, and that's being generous about it. You
Yeah, I mean, okay, so Russia's not based. Okay, so when do you take away like the gay flag at every police department in my country, at every school in my country? That includes like kindergarten. When do you stop the education in these places? Um, when do you stop? Okay, then just stop gay marriage, stop gay adoption. In Canada, if you try to convert a child from again, if the child is cis and wants to go trans, you're going to jail. And it could be just you verbally trying to persuade them, right? So when Canada comes up with that, I will say that, well, I mean, Russia already has that, but Russia's not based. But when Russia catches up to non-based Russia, I will, I'll say, yeah, well, you did it. And at least half of those things are also true in the States, and not to mention Europe. So yeah, when you catch up, I'll say, wow, you're not based just like Russia. Um, or when when they go on with the whole Rabbi Putin. I just want to mention this great little thing that Eric Streicher wrote today. He said the Jewish organization inside Iran claims to be anti-Israel and pro-Ayatollah. There were Jewish orgs inside Germany during the 30s that claimed to support Hitler. And he goes on, Jay's trying to keep a foot in every door does not mean all geopolitical disputes are crisis actors in a new world order shadow puppet play. Outside of Russia, name a Jewish organization anywhere in the world that isn't pro-Ukraine US. Did the Chabad tell the Kremlin to arm Hezbollah? Did it did it tell him to go save Assad in Syria or help Iran survive U.S. sanctions? Because Russia right now is already going to give Iran um, S-400 systems. They're also discussing Su-35 fighter jets because the other thing that Russia is going to work on now that Kazakhstan is settled is they want a pipeline basically for Iran to go straight north, and they need Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan to play ball here. But Russia's going to work its way basically into the Persian Gulf, and they'll do it by using India, because India also has been discussing uh, Russian gas and oil, right? So um, he goes on to say Jews undoubtedly hold some power in Russia, but unlike the U.S., the Kremlin sometimes puts its own interests first on foreign policy. Russia is a much better and saner actor than It goes on and on, but um, he's right. They don't always do it. They don't have this immense power. They cannot satisfy the let's say the Spurg police, Spurg spiraling, uh, value spiraling police on the dissident right. But if we're realistic, right? If we're realistic, when you stop supporting, uh, let's say, I don't know, forces against Assad in Syria, okay, I'll pay attention then. Then you'll be not based just like Russia.
Based on what? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I had to. I had to at least once. But also, just circling back to borrow a term from our wonderful press secretary, in terms of Eastern European countries and their role in this, Hungary has received a now Hungary, the country
Yes.
that Biden said was ruled by a totalitarian, said one of his prime objectives of his administration in Europe would be to fight these totalitarian regimes, Poland and Hungary in Europe, has
Yes.
received a request to host U.S. troops.
Oh, yes, I heard about
Now,
that.
it doesn't look like it's going to happen, but after all this time, and again, it really shows that Orban is unique among the European nationalists of various countries, particularly Central and Eastern European countries, where he's the only one with the real sense, at least, to not be blindly pro-West in terms of foreign policy matters. Because, again, we've touched on it before. You have this very weird disconnect in Poland where they want to be culturally Polish, they want to be nationalist, they want to be Catholic, they want to be all these things, which there's not necessarily anything wrong with any of those things. But then that's all contingent on the fact that they're going to be the meat shield if anything ever happens between the West and Russia. And
Yeah.
uh, once that Russian threat dissipates, the traditional Polish values dissipate. Now, what Hungary has done, Hungary was in a similar position up until a few years ago. I would say about 2017, 2018 is when you really saw that shift. Even maybe a little before, like 2016. But point being is mid 2010s. They decide maybe Russia isn't the great terror maybe it was as the Soviet Union. Maybe we can let bygones be bygones. Maybe we can, let go of the past and pursue a sane foreign policy. So they've walked this tightrope between East and West. Turkey, which of course wasn't under Soviet or communist occupation, did much the same. You saw, again, it's very strange. Some countries go back and forth. For example, you'll look at Bulgaria is a very strange one where sometimes it seems they have very pragmatic relationship with Russia, but other times they are uh, a just a NATO vassal. Romania is pretty strongly in the NATO camp. They're much like Poland in that sense. But point being is, with Hungary, you have this country that really stands out among the European nationalists in Central and Eastern Europe in the terms that it's not necessarily pro-Russia, but it's pragmatic about its approach to this massive country on their border, this massive military power in the world. And although it's not an economic powerhouse or anything, it's still sizable economy and massive energy exporter. So you do get that, and then I don't know. I just think the gall of like Biden, and this isn't a surprise to the American administration that, of course, Hungary and Poland and X, Y, and Z are totalitarian. They're authoritarian. They're it's a new 21st century fascism. But when it comes time to make Russia quake in their boots, hey, we need your strong patriotic and nationalistic virtues to stand up against your former oppressors or whatever the canned line is that they're throwing out nowadays. And with also just this news in general, there was an interesting development where Russia announced a cooperation with it was Cuba, Venezuela, and I believe also Nicaragua, where they were beginning to negotiate cooperation between those countries in general and those countries with Russia. Now, this is an obvious response to the NATO troops moving to the American border, and a lot of people have compared this to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, theoretically, yes, it is Russian troops showing up in America's backyard, blah blah blah. But again, I don't think we're going to see any ICBMs in Cuba anytime soon. And again, I
Yeah.
don't. And with how close we came to that metaphorical midnight, so to speak, in the 1960s, I don't think even a lot of Russians would be eager to try that again. But I don't think it'll go this far, but there always is that danger, and we saw that during the Cold War, where Russia will get meticulously bogged down in these, for example, Latin American states, while again you have these revolts in Poland. Now that's more so referring to something like the 80s, but they'll you, they'll direct their attention from their backyard to their immediate surrounding spheres of influence just to get one up over the Americans. Now again, theoretically, what they're doing is making sense, putting that counterbalance to Ukraine or the Baltic states or whatever. But and I don't think they will, but they always do run the risk of getting too engrossed in those countries.
Right. And the other thing that Russia is now going to do that they've announced is they are going to now implement some of the missile technologies that are nuclear powered. Some of these can fly around for months, and they can just circle and circle and circle certain areas. They're incredibly fast. They're almost impossible to knock down. I have a feeling that what they'll do is play a game where that sub that goes to Venezuela or Nicaragua or maybe even Cuba, right? You don't know if that sub has that, right? They don't necessarily have to build those bases. They can launch them from there if they want to. Uh, it's a counterbalance. It's a threat to counteract other threats that are imposed on its borders. So um, I think Russia is very confident of that. Um, I think they're confident that their missile technology is probably close to a decade ahead of the US's. And this is why, the US is concerned about this. Now, I will also say that, part of the sanctions proposals, one of them was the whole microchip thing, right? Well, Russia used to have like their own microchip facilities, right, during the Soviet Union. Um, but just to clear things up, like every military aircraft, its microchips don't come from anywhere. Russia makes its own microchips, and their civilian aircraft also will have them. They'll also have their own jets now. I think there's a P-16, P-35, and a P-50 coming up, but the P-16 is nearly done. So no more reliance on not Boeing, General Electric. There's another one, Whitney, Pratt Whitney. So um, because that was also like one of the sanctions that were placed on Russia uh, back in 2014. So, like I say, that like Russia, I think, has been preparing for this event, and we've already discussed on this show way back when Russia changed its constitution. One of the clauses in the constitution is to let it be known that Russia, in its heart, is this Slavic nation, and the original founding Russians are the Russians of Russia, right? That's why in Russia, um, Russian is spelt two different ways, whether like you're an actual Russian or you're
Civic
a
versus
not.
ethnic identity.
Yes, exactly, right. Well, I mean, the American Constitution or Britain will never have a clause like that ever. So, like, and no dual citizenship. If you study abroad, you can't ever be a president or a leader of the country. You can't even be in politics. So
Or like even a desk jockey bureaucrat. Like you can't work at whatever,
that's right.
pencil
That's right.
pushing jobs they have running their administration. So it's
Right.
very stringent. We'll see how well it's enforced because it is a relatively new policy. But if it is enforced at least to a reasonable degree, then it's certainly going to clean up a lot of problems that we have even again here in the West when it comes to split loyalties or just people who are outright loyal to
Yeah.
foreign
And
entities
I think
altogether.
generally the way things go is that once it's a law, the culture eventually catches up with it. In the same way that once nobody wanted abortion or gay marriage, but once they were laws, eventually they caught up with it. Um, there are other laws coming down the pike,
Yeah,
such that will limit abortion and so on and so on.
despite what liberals and libertarians will tell you, most people, once given an order, will generally follow it. Maybe not
Yeah.
enthusiastically, maybe they won't even believe in it, but just out of the sheer unwillingness to challenge the status quo or to challenge the structures of authority, they'll just go along with it because it doesn't impact me. And again, that's how we got things like abortion, gay marriage, transgenderism in the West. That's how those things came about because people were just like, "Oh, who cares? It doesn't bother me. It doesn't affect me."
Right, right, right. And
Um,
until it does.
yeah, and until it does, and then you get the anti woke liberals who, hey, we're just 2,000 Democrats, but I think you should accommodate us. I could do an entire tirade on those, but I'll spare you guys that for now. But again, it works in the opposite direction too. It works with more nationalistic and socially conservative values as well. If you have somebody willing and able to implement those.
Hmm. Hmm.
But with that being said, there was an interesting admission by some American military industrial complex companies that, oh yeah, we want conflict to break out in Ukraine because it's personally good for our margins. Uh, I think it was either Raytheon or Lockheed Martin put out, of course, one of their dumb Twitter interns put out something that more or less gave the game away. Now, how intentional that was it just, again, some dumb 20 something year old who landed their first job in the corporate world doing that, some aspiring girl boss, if you will, but um, for all we know, it could have been something like that, or again, they become less and less subtle over time because despite how desperate the situation is, and it's certainly not a monolithic attitude, some of them are aware of how bad things are for them, but there also is this hubris, this arrogance, this idea that oh we're untouchable. Of course we could beat Russia in a war, despite what their own war games say, and again they're famous for even rigging those war games. If you want to talk about the 2002 or 2003 Millennium Challenge with the hypothetical war with Iran, and even in the 2018 war games in the Baltic Sea and in East Asia, American forces found themselves on the losing side on both of those. But with that, you still have these military industrial complex companies more or less giving away the game, saying, yeah, we profit off your bloodshed and suffering, and we enjoy this and we think it's funny. Now, of course, that comes as a surprise to nobody, but it still is interesting to see thrown out there. And again, I think when it comes to this whole Russia Ukraine non invasion, because again, you look at the position of these Russian troops, for example, the maps that people show to show the buildup of Russian troops cite troops in the Moscow Oblast. So that's how serious they are, of course. Twitter scholars have come up with such wonderful takes as Transcarpathia is closer to Italy than Kiev is to the Russian border, so therefore Ukraine should be independent. Even though I take that as Italy should get Transcarpathia, Russia should get the rest. Maybe give a couple things to Romania, Hungary here and there. We can decide the details later. The other one is, well, if Russia causes trouble, why don't we just simply invade them via Alaska into the Far East and Siberia? Because that is a very hospitable terrain that would allow itself well to a massive invasion. I'm sure that Russia has not anticipated them using the back door, which is why you have constant Russian flyovers, Alaska, and American airspace surrounding Alaska, because they have not anticipated such a possibility. Vladivostok isn't a city in the east. Again, I know that's more in, like, Asia proper, but still, like, there's major settlements in eastern Russia. It's not like this abandoned wasteland as most people seem to believe it is. So, just overall, genius takes all around from our foreign policy experts and their clinger-ons. But, of course, one man bucking the trend yet again, love him or hate him, Tucker Carlson has
Hmm.
has outright called out, and he's done this with Syria, he's done this with Iran. And again, whether you want to call him controlled opposition or whatever, the point is that this narrative is getting out there by somebody who has millions of viewers every night. It doesn't matter whether he's just, sowing the seeds, playing part of the big game, which I think there's a convincing argument that could be made that, yeah, he's playing the big game. But again, much like the Trump phenomenon, what he's saying, whether it's genuine or completely just lying in our face, is useful to us. And for the past several weeks, he's been a spearhead against the idea of intervention in Ukraine. He's called for outright cooperation with Russia over Ukraine, still playing that residual American nationalist that we can mend relations and take on China together. This sort of 2016, 2017 idea that really has no business being around after relations were. I would say that could have been done in 2000, pre-George at the latest, 2008 at the latest, when something like that could have even been attempted. But it's still a popular talking point, and it's a much better alternative, I suppose, than to whatever the neoconservatives are proposing we do. But with all of that, you have him constantly bucking this trend, this pro-war trend, in the media, and of course he is the most popular media figure in America, even though it's sort of a big fish in a small pond when we're talking about cable media. But in the way that disseminates across the internet and pundits and people parrot those talking points, it is a bit of a food chain, and he's sitting at the top of whatever this multimedia food chain is when it comes to especially American conservative media. Tucker Carlson is the closest thing American conservatives have to a figurehead, I would say, aside from Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, he, I think he, first of all, understands that, registered Republicans, people most likely to vote Republicans, are not on side about a war in Eastern Europe between, let's say, NATO and Russia, or Ukraine and Russia, or America, Ukraine and Russia. They don't want any of those scenarios. And well, yes, official libs on Twitter, the blue check marks, are going to be for it. And you saw that in some of the briefings where they're like, how are you letting that evil Putin, get away with this? Why are we wasting time? It's just hilarious to me. Um, I think, completely understands. Uh, uh, you know, you can say all kinds of things about him, you know, kosher right, so on and so on. But at the end of the day, what he's saying has costs. And what he's saying were actually talking points that only existed on the alt right between 2016 and 2018.
And apparently there was a
Four
clip
to
within
six
the
years
same
later,
series of
these are
episodes.
mainstream talking points,
There were,
right?
yes, and there was a clip within one of these series of episodes over this past week where apparently there was some minor right wing figure on our side who he got sent the tweet of and read live on air by one of his producers. So uh, I can't remember who it was, but point being, it was somebody like uh, like one of those people with 10 to 15K Twitter followers, just getting his tweet read live on air by Tucker Carlson. I don't think he credited him outright because that it's not really something he could have done, but Yeah, he read that, and of course, again, you make great points with the fact that yeah, even if he is controlled op, he knows his base, and even if we're to assume the worst about him, they're scraping the bottom of the barrel where they have to make some of these concessions to their own detriment. Now, can they recover
Yes.
from this? Possibly, but point being is they have to actively harm themselves in the hopes of saving themselves. Sort of like cutting off a pinky to save the hand, where
Right.
the infection might still spread, but there's that chance it might be cut off, and that's the
Great
gamble they're
analogy,
taking.
by the way. That's really good. No,
Oh,
I'm just
thank you.
saying that. I don't
I'm
have
glad you
anything.
think so. I'm glad you think I'm such a this astute co-host. But continue.
No, no. I was just gonna echo what you were saying. Yeah. There is a cost. Like if Trump had never been in office, they wouldn't have to fortify the election, which lost them legitimacy, which caused January the 6th. Like all of these things have a cost, you know? Like like I remember what I was saying in 2020, just before the election. Every gay op will have a cost. Every gay op will lead to a new gay op, and every one, all of them, will erode and delegitimize the entire structure, right? And that is what is happening. They know that. They're buying time. And now we're seeing basically external pressures. Now, it didn't have to be this way because, as we've reported on it, the buildup, the so-called buildup on the border, the imminent Russian invasion began roughly around November 8th to November 10th. That's when you got the first reports. And then Ukraine said, no, there isn't. Don't worry about it. Then, of course, Ukraine would change its mind after the Americans were even more vociferous about it. And that whole thing is still, going on. So we're on day 78 of this. And I'm just saying that external pressure and the pressure from within, right, is creating this delegitimization in people's eyes. But as long as you bring up Tucker, we should mention that Tucker's also been talking about the Canadian truckers. His name escapes me now, and I hate myself for it. But he had the leader on the show, and it was a really nice interview, really warm interview. And this is over 40 miles long now. GoFundMe has stopped the campaign apparently at around 7 million, or just under 7 million. And if you saw the briefing with Trudeau, you saw a guy that was scared. He tried to sideline the whole thing after ignoring this, because of course this whole thing started over 10 days ago. We're on day 12. And the media has tend to ignore it just the way it's done with every other anti-COVID protest. And I get it. I know a lot of the people who fixate on this issue, the memes are really banal. They're very normie con memes. I understand that, but I think you have to look at this more strategically from the point of view that anything that delegitimizes the system is actually good in the long run.
Yes, and
Uh,
anything that appeals to the masses is going to be a bit lowbrow to us snobs, and I have no problem calling myself one. I have no problem calling you one. I have no problem calling this audience one because just looking at the sort of circles we run in, when it comes to these things, yes, we are a bit snobbish. We have very high standards, perhaps even unrealistic standards about the way things should be, especially when it comes to the way information disseminates in a mass formation. So that's the reason I will tacitly, like, as much as I might think it's like cringe or boomer or whatever you want to call it, I will support things like, say, Let's Go Brandon or whatever these things are because they have that right mass appeal that even if I am personally not enthralled by them, it moves the right people in the right direction.
mhm. Yeah, and this is an organic movement. That's why it's GoFundMe. right? There's no big Davos people supporting this. Um, Schwab is not behind this. Bill Gates is not behind this.
Not even
Um,
an outright eccentric billionaire. Like I know, like Elon Musk said some stuff in support of it, but I don't think he's
he did,
offered.
he
I
did,
don't think
which
he's
I
offered
think
any material
infuriates
support.
them.
Um,
Yeah, and especially after Neil Young canceled himself.
oh yeah, that whole yeah, the culture wars into Spotify because apparently Joe Rogan's a real threat to national security. That's another thing. A guy who somebody like you or I might not find that impressive, but he's reaching the masses.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, these divisions are very real. They're very serious, and it is comparable to a good degree with the kind of skepticism that set in the Soviet Union in the late 70s, and definitely bloomed in the 80s. Right? Even Brezhnev was aware of this and talked about it. Um, but I would say that it is a very funny story because, like as I was saying, Trudeau, after he said that this was a fringe group, a minority that doesn't represent Canadians, in a subtle way saying these people aren't really Canadian. And of course, um, uh, I know a friend of mine who has to deal with a lot of shit libs who say, some of them did Nazi salutes. It's like, yeah, I know. Uh, Canadian intelligence goes and poses, pretends to be a trucker that gives a Nazi salute.
I
I
think
get
I
it.
think you got wrong. I think those were just the Ukrainian diaspora.
But you know what? I said, what you tell you know what you tell them? Well, I mean, 92% of the people didn't do a Nazi salute. So, there's that. Just to bring back the Floyd riots, right?
Yeah,
So,
mostly non-Roman protests.
yeah, but I think the most so of course Trudeau said that he came in contact after. I mean, he always looks weak to me, but he looked particularly weak in his address, trying to dismiss all of this. But he said that he came in contact with somebody that might have one of the COOF variants. So he has gone into isolation for 5 days. Of course he has, because he can't deal with this. He literally can't deal with this.
Yes, very convenient. Monsieur.
But the definitely the funniest story. The funniest story for anybody who's like, and why would you be aware of Canadian politics, is a guy named Jagmeet Singh. Right. So Jagmeet Singh is leader of the NDP party. And the NDP party is always in a race with the Liberals about who is more woke. Um, that's how the NDP survives, is to outwoke the Liberals. But the hilarious thing happened. Jagmeet Singh's brother-in-law, Jadveer Singh Dhaliwal, sorry, donated $13,000 to the truckers.
Yes, two very Anglo French
This is
Canadians having a
a
feud over
huge,
politics. I see.
yeah, that's right. So there are all sorts of measures being put in place now. Ottawa is right on the border with Quebec. I think people know about the kind of coof tyranny that's going on in Quebec. So now it's not good enough to go to a supermarket. You have to go with a clerk, a health something something, that follows you around and makes sure to keep an eye on you, that you strictly stay in the food aisles, get your food, and leave, which I assume is going to start lineups, right?
So more
So Ottawa
superfluous
is right
jobs for
on the
middle-aged
border.
women is what you're telling me?
Yeah, with Quebec, the town on the other side is Hull, in a region that it's called Gatineau, and so Gatineau, Quebec has in Hull has blocked one of the roads leading into Ottawa. Now this is really going to be something. I mean, I think it will probably still be ignored. Now, the CBC in Canada has turned off all the comments on its YouTube channel. And of course, thank God they got rid of the dislike. Because I mean, you might think, like, once in a while, CNN gets super ratioed. Definitely Biden's YouTube channel got ratioed all the time. But the CBC in Canada, man, it was at Biden level ratios until YouTube introduced this. So you can see, like, the civilization is afraid. They do not want to acknowledge the unhappiness within it, right? And that's it. It's one of the things that makes it sound eerily similar with the late stages of the Soviet Union.
Oh yes, because it's
So,
not just unhappiness; a it's an unhappiness that contradicts all the civilizational values they've reported for the last century at least, because it's showing clearly it's not just, oh, our ideas failed here, here, and here, or no, it's our ideas have been a systemic failure and the people are rejecting them wholesale. Not just this, this, and this, not just conservatives are mad about this, liberals are mad about this. No, they're rejecting the entirety, even if they don't realize it, even if they haven't mentally said, I'm done with liberalism, I'm done with Western values, so to speak. Even if just an implicit realization, they've still rejected it wholesale.
mm, now people are trying to brand, you know, these truckers are dangerous. It's Canada's January the 6th event in the making. It's just so overblown. Like January the 6th is overblown. Now it's even, of course, Canada has to make it completely farcical, right? Like whatever America does, Canada has to make the same thing more farcical. Like that's Canada's great contribution. Because somebody tweeted something like, if anything, we should grab Trudeau by the something damn neck and kick the blank out of him for what he's done. Like, yeah, I mean, you can get mad. That's okay.
I don't have it on hand, but I saw some political cartoonist had a bunch of semi trucks where the trailers always said fascism on it. And I started wondering what was happening to my order. It looks like they're just back to in Canada.
Look, just I'm honestly surprised that they haven't mentioned. Now they've called some of them Nazis and white supremacists that are doing this, even though you have like people who are clearly from the Indian subcontinent that are also involved. Like but they're white, of course, because it's an easy slur, right? It's an easy way to delegitimize somebody or to call them a conspiracy theorist. But I mean, it's not really working that well. They'll just have to keep the pretense, and all of this is really just to kick the can down the road. And as we've discussed, part of these measures is to create a system when things get really, really shitty. This is the system, these passports. Geo, our friend Geo, from Twitter. I'm actually friends with Geo in real life. I don't know if people know that, but
Look, you got to watch out for that Toronto cabal. It's dangerous stuff up there.
I love Geo. Geo's a very, very intelligent young man. And if you go to his Odyssey channel or YouTube channel, you should sub. And he did a great stream on the truckers and what he said. You know, he brought up this whole thing about how this whole, this the vax is like a ridiculous civic religion sacrament. That's what it's turned into, because in a way they can't articulate what is actually happening, right? Um, the reason these things become so heated is because they represent, or they're immediately politicized because there are bigger systemic issues involved. And people recognize that, I think, to some degree, but it's difficult to articulate it. It's very much still in people's subconscious right now. And anyhow, Geo had a really great stream on this that people should, when they have some time, they should go and watch it.
Yeah, certainly.
But he
I would
mentioned, for
co-sign that.
instance, like social distancing. This will be something that, if it really becomes entrenched in society, there will be definitely other crises that are going to come in the West. These will not subside. Like, things really will get worse before they get better.
Are you giving me a springboard? I feel like you're giving me a springboard for this next topic I want to talk about.
Okay, let's get to that springboard.
So it was, I believe, somewhere off the interstate in Pennsylvania, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, America. Point being is a bunch of lab monkeys were being transported from one facility to another, and all of a sudden the truck just crashes. These monkeys who are being used for medical research all escape, and of course they apprehend them in a timely manner. But two of the agents that were apprehending them reported symptoms of whatever disease. Now, we talked about a couple weeks back, and for the past few episodes, that they are slowly but surely starting to pivot the narrative. That, for example, Boris Johnson's thrown up the white flag. Biden said there's no federal solution. Several American states have opted on the side of, um, again, rejecting the mandates. Ireland has lifted up, with the exception, pretty much I pointed out, of France, Germany, and Italy. It looks like most of the world is going in the direction of lifting restrictions. A few exceptions here and there. But we established last week that we both generally agree that's something of what will be breathing room for us. It's a few months of peace and quiet, relative peace and quiet, where we're allowed to live normally, similar to what they did when they started lifting a lot of the restrictions in spring, summer of last year when they got rid of a lot of the mask mandates in a lot of places where, again, it was this rest easy thing before they come back with whatever new variant or whatever new crisis. But now, I think it looks like, and again, my main contention with this story is if something of this scale actually happened, it would not have been reported in a mainstream outlet to the extent that it was reported. Like, nobody would have heard about this. We wouldn't have heard about this, which makes me think, number one, they're setting up the stage for something. And it feels almost identical to Wuhan in, January, February 2020. Just this absurd thing where these people come down with this mysterious illness because of, whatever conspicuous work they were doing. And again, it just feels like a play-by-play copy of whatever they're doing now. And I don't know, maybe that won't be the new one, but it's showing the kind of narratives that they're prepared to run in the future. Like almost as soon as these countries started lifting restrictions, it's like boom, that story comes out. And of course, you've also been preempted with a lot of is climate change causing strokes? Is climate change causing heart attacks? Or all this various sort of stuff? Or is cannabis doing this? Where they're setting up, just they're sowing the seeds for all these new crises that they will drop one by one as needed. That they will say we have to go into lockdown or implement X, Y, or Z restrictions because of this current crisis. And because it's really the only form of legitimacy the West has left. If the government, if the state can protect you from an external or internal crisis. And shown by the past 2 years between the lockdowns and the pandemic, the whatever you want to call it, convid, and even the Black Lives Matter rallies and riots, the state has shown itself either unwilling or incapable of actually fulfilling that role, but they've convinced enough of the population that they are capable of fulfilling that role and willing to fulfill that role.
Hmm.
And that's all that takes. You just need just enough of the population to control society. Nowhere near the majority, just enough. That's only the really way you can find it. And with all that being said, it looks like they're setting up the narratives for just enough people to go along with whatever new crisis or scandal or whatever they have up their sleeve to maintain whatever slipping bit of legitimacy that they have. And although this is a minor story on the surface, I think it's a good springboard into what we had to look forward to. Like I said, maybe this story will go nowhere, but maybe in 6 months you'll see a story that reads almost exactly like this that they start using to push X, Y, or Z.
Right, because like, I mean, I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine back, I think, in 2015 or 2016, and I said to him, I said, for what is coming up, the only way that the West can remain intact, or America in particular, is to become more authoritarian. There is no option. I mean, they're much more sophisticated than any system that has ever existed before. But I think, yeah, I know I never thought about it that way. Like, they could use this later for another scare. They could also pivot and just say, no, we got to do a different scare. Like, they're, you know, they're exhausted. Any more pharma, health science stuff uh, is just going to be scoffed at. Who knows? Like, b- but I'm just saying that the system that they uh, have in place, it is modular. It can be used for something else. Like I say, they have normalized distancing. They have normalized staying in your home. So far,
Well,
I
the old
mean,
the old quip is like, we still take our shoes off at the airport, and it's been 20 years, and we have no reason to believe that social distancing or any of these other things would not become as lodged in society as, say, post 9/11 security measures.
yes, yeah, that's a good point.
And that's, of course, despite the gross ineffectiveness of the TSA, where 95% of contraband gets through test runs on the TSA and stuff. And like that stuff, like even the mainstream media will report. And again, even the mainstream media will throw a
Stop
bone.
giving me hope.
we'll throw a bone to our side every once in a while and say like, oh, look at the mandates, whatever. Apparently, there were some quote unquote medical professionals who testified under oath to some of the more severe side effects of the what actually those accusations actually carrying some water. So it does look like, again, they're giving you some table scraps to keep you appeased, and while they do this narrative shift. Now, again, I don't know what this narrative shift will look like, but I can almost certainly guarantee you that there will be one over the course of the next year.
Yeah. I mean, it is something that we should be on the watch for, and we will. Yeah.
And you can
I
you
mean,
can you can tell actually that they're doing some A/B testing or whatever you want to call it, where they'll cast out stories that are increasingly more absurd and less absurd. For example, I'm sure you all remember the various times they tried to gin up interest in the whole UFO stories over the course of the past couple years, where it's like, oh, UFOs, nobody cares, and outright people are
yeah.
becoming like, we're to the point where it's like, it's becoming the skeptic's position not to believe in UFOs. And then they'll try climate change or, look, this new variant. Just, again, all these various things they can throw out to varying degrees of severity and absurdness to see what really sticks with the population. So, again, that breathing room might be more than a few months, might be less than a few months, but point being is they're giving us a little bit of a breather. They're, letting us get our guard down while they find out whatever dumb trick they're going to pull on us next. Now, again, these things have diminishing returns, much like color revolutions, where you can only do these fake crises so many times before the population just starts to lose confidence in you and demand these absurd loyalty tests, which I think the what is a primary example of. Same with a lot of the BLM stuff. That's just more of an absurd loyalty test as well. And again, these things have diminishing returns. You can only do these things so many times. There's no set limit. For example, it's not like, oh, you can only do this this many times. But again, it wears on the population the more you do it, and especially the more frequently you do it, when you don't space them out.
Yeah. 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 I mean, they are very intelligent, they are the managerial class. They have thought and planned long and hard on this. I think we did a show way back about how this sort of thing. Well, you have guys like James Burnham, but it really started to kick in terms of like policy in the early 70s. And then, Foucault in the 90s making the deal with the corporations and so on.
Oh, certainly. And I just in general, and the way these people cement themselves into a late civilization, and to various different effects into various levels of success. But to paraphrase your famous quote, the only empire in the world that's ever had a Disneyland. It's it's really the only way you can describe the American Empire. And it's I believe, in my words previously, the most farcical empire the world has ever seen. Of course, there's the very common meme of clown world or clown country. Those are valid too. I won't disparage any of those, but whatever one of those you want to apply to this is really the only proper way to understand the situation. Now, again, I didn't live through the collapse of the Soviet Union. I wasn't even alive to watch it from the outside, but I don't know. We probably have somebody who lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union who watched the show. I just know, based on our audience and based on the kind of people who watch the show, one of you has had to. So, was it this absurd in the 1980s Soviet Union? Was it this absurd in any other crumbling empire at any point in human history? I say bar none. And I say with certainty, with my decent but not extraordinary knowledge of history, the most farcical empire in history, the American Empire. No contest.
Yeah, I mean, I do remember that time, and I do remember the kind of upheaval, the kind of dread and uncertainty that you could see the images, from Poland, from Russia, from all those places. Chernobyl bleeds into that as well. The solidarity movement. Um, like you could tell that it was the people that did have that had lost faith um in their system, and of course the tensions of division that were latent were coming to the surface. Yeah, no question.
Yeah, especially with the structure of the Soviet Union. Again, the old joke about how it was just a bunch of cabals of feuding ethnic groups replacing each other one after the other, whether that be the Jews, the Georgians, the Ukrainians, etc. But yeah, especially with that. But again, even that is nowhere near as farcical as the American Empire. And just to cap off the show with on that point, from the Economist, as of yesterday. Countries do not redraw each other's borders by force. A successful Russian invasion of Ukraine would rip up that norm because, um, Kosovo doesn't exist. The invasion of
Yeah,
Iraq
that's right.
never happened. Syria never happened. The SDF isn't there. Taiwan isn't, propped up as a de facto state by the Western powers. None of this. You simply just don't read. Cyprus wasn't invaded by Turkey. That never happened. A NATO
Yeah.
member would never do such a thing to another sovereign nation, as we all
Oh,
know.
and another NATO member.
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, another free and democratic country invaded by another free and democratic country just simply does not happen. That norm has been well established over the past yeah, it's just always been there. Okay, countries just don't ask each other. That's just part of the American-led world order. Yeah, you see, ever since we beat the mid-century Germans, to borrow a term from the illustrious academic agent, if you will, it just simply doesn't happen. We just don't do things that way anymore. I I can only keep this bit up for so long. This is, pardon my French, one of the fucking stupidest articles I've seen on the mainstream media, and I don't even know how long. Like, and
Uh-huh.
again, like you'll get the normal pause, you'll get like the normal like hot button issues, but again, you'll just learn to brush those off over time, just because it's like okay, they support the
Because you'll
LGBTQ
go
CIA.
insane if you
Yeah,
try to.
yeah, you will, and there's many good channels out there that are both still active and inactive that I do think have driven themselves near insanity, just dedicating themselves to making fun of and debunking these articles. Again, nothing personal against these people. I just think that they've done it to the detriment of possibly their own health. But it's these kind of articles that are really the ones that make my blood boil because of just the brazenness, the audacity of
Hmm.
that. Like, how stupid do you think we are? And again, like I know the average American or average person in general, whether no matter where they are from the world, they're not too well versed in global politics and world history or whatever. And I'm not even saying I'm that well versed, and I'm decently read, and I could certainly learn more. I think we all could, but how fucking stupid do you think I have to be to take you at face value on that? And
Yeah.
it's like when you report on these things, like, um, I don't know. Maybe if you polled the average, I'm sure, obviously, being much closer to home, many more Europeans would know about that. But even like your average American or Canadian, I bet a good chunk of them would know that Turkey has invaded Cyprus, and they might not know that the occupation is still going on or whatever, but they would have known that would have happened at some point, or just any of these various conflicts. And it's and I mean, even more popular in the public consciousness would be the Yugoslav wars and the creation of Kosovo and the drawing of the borders of these post Yugoslav countries. It's like
Yeah.
it's it's
You, you,
it,
you know,
it's it's so
go ahead.
I feel like it's such an insult to our intelligence as a
I
civilization.
know.
Like I'm not saying, and again, I'll trash this civilization up and down every day. Some might argue that's what the show is about. Sort of laughing at Western civilization as it crashes and burns. I don't necessarily intend for it to be that way. It just sort of turns out that way sometimes. Look, no hard feelings, but again, like no matter how like stuck up or condescending we can be at our worst, I would like to think, and I can say with near certainty, that we've never treated you, our audience, like you were that stupid.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, we have our opinion, we have our angles. I don't claim objectivity, and I don't care if you want to
Yeah,
come back and listen.
that is the hook. We don't pretend to be objective.
I am not being objective. Um, you know, our chats frequently have counter arguments and the such. Like, yeah, that's fine. I'm giving you my angle, but we have said things a long while ago, and our predictions were pretty damn good. I mean, I remember. I think when you first started having me as a co-host, I think early on, I said if there were a war in Ukraine involving NATO, I said I would bet several Southern Slavic people countries would not involve them. They would just say no, we're not doing this.
Yeah, and
And
that didn't
Croatia and
necessarily sound like
Bulgaria
an
in 24 hours just said that.
yeah, and like that didn't sound like too like much of like an outlandish take, but it sounded like a meta take, like something that was we're just talking completely theoretical, but then you actually see pen put to paper and see that actually
Yeah,
happen.
that's right. And I had said that 4 years ago.
Yeah, I remember. I remember when I think it was in 2018 when all these Balkan states were trying to get into the EU and NATO. I think that's was around the time you
Hmm.
said that.
Hmm.
So, um, I mean, with all that being said, it's like, you know, I don't claim a perfect track record, but I think I think we've done pretty well for ourselves, all things considered.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, we haven't been always right, but
And
I
I don't
think
think
we've
we
been
ever
pretty
denied
good.
that either. Like
Yeah,
um, I know that if Idlib doesn't fall by this summer, I'm really going to have to eat my hat. But
yeah.
I'm sticking to my guns. It's the most definitive prediction I've ever made on the show, and I'm sticking to my guns on it. And if you have anything else, if you have anything you think we missed, we can certainly go over that. If not, I can go ahead and wrap this up.
No, I don't. I don't have anything other than what we covered.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in to this most interesting episode of the War Report. We will certainly be back
Excuse
next
me.
time with more news. Possibly Vile Varangian coming down the pipe sometime soon for his semi-annual appearance. We'll just have to get the details ironed out about that. But we will see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Yeah, take care, guys. Stay warm.
Oh yeah, don't get me started, man.
Freezing us.
But yeah, yes. For those of you who do not live in the deep south, stay warm. And yeah, yeah. If any of you staying down there want to give your old pal Constantine Martelli a nice vacation home, I'm all up for it. But I suppose we'll see you guys next episode, and goodbye.
Take care, guys.